So this is where things begin to get a little bit complex. And admittedly, I'm not entirely certain where this discussion is going to go and what terrain it's going to cover, if you like the metaphor of travel or journey. Discourse as a kind of ground and the linearity of the flow of narration as a path, covering trails and routes, along that ground, and even discussing, that metaphor returns me to certain ideas in the configuration of exchanges and messages back and forth around this topic of foam and a message at the intersection of this topic of foam and poetics, derived from space-time communication coordinate, and this space-time communication coordinate refers to this idea, and the space-time communication coordinate that I'm referring to doesn't take a long route. It's not a circuitous and rambling and fantastic journey or odyssey, if one wants to return to the sort of the Greek archetype of journey, either away from or to home. The arcane archetype of journey must be a leaving home, right? Like in the sense of, and it can be motivated by different reasons. Oedipus leaving home to deny and defeat, the fate that belongs to his destiny, and of course he fails to do so. But also, the journey home, the return, is the completion of the journey. So the journey, we think of as linear in a way, but it is also a kind of circle, and belongs to the notion of the circle. And one of the ways, both symbolically and literally, in terms of the physics of journey, that we navigate our journeys is through positions of stars, particularly what's sometimes referred to as fixed stars or bright stars. But the idea of one's journey being written in the stars as astrology, and the actual fact that sailors utilized stars to navigate on open seas where there were otherwise no landscape markers to utilize to interpret one's position on this plane of physical existence, and toward some determined destination, is that fact that the stars serve these twin metaphorical and literal purposes in the journey is certainly not a coincidence. And so this message of a configuration of stars that belong to this system. Alpha Phoenicis is Phoenicis. This is a difficult word to pronounce. Is is a binary star, right? It's the brightest star in the constellation of Phoenix, and as such, it's one of these stars that can be used for navigation. But beyond that, it refers to this idea of this mythical creature called the Phoenix, and not just in one designation, but in interesting multiple ways. So, in Arabic, the name of this particular star is El-Anqua, the Phoenix, and in Chinese as well, it's referred to as the Firebird. So the symbolic significance of this star, provided as message, certainly can't be overlooked in relationship to my response to this discourse on foam. And foam, at first, my first thoughts of foam, have very little to do with this idea of constellar, navigation and its relationship to journey, and then even beyond that, like what if we add Firebird or Phoenix, the mythical creature who rises from the ashes, which is again a rejuvenation and a restoration myth that relates to other figures of such myths, the destruction of the world and the rebirth, and this cycle of this Shivaic almost, right, cycle of creation, destruction that generates change. So in some ways, the Firebird or the Phoenix is resistant to destruction in ways that could be useful in times of dark struggle and destruction like we have now, right? That Vladimir Putin not only threatens the lives of the Ukrainians, that his genocide of the Ukrainians represents, but threatens all of our lives with the threat of nuclear holocaust hanging over us once again, as it did in the Reagan era, if you recall the Reagan era, or care to, or care to look back critically at those myths of what this Republican cowboy hero represents to us now, and compared to what he actually did, which was to really create in the at least unconscious American psyche, the persistent threat, of destruction of not only our nation but our planet, and this seed, right, or this inception of a Holocaust scenario, and how it played out in the sort of sci-fi Hollywood construct that Ronald Reagan helped to manufacture. It is in a certain way being played out today on multiple stages, right? It gets played out when a basically good-hearted person like Will Smith, makes one mistake because he's being pushed to the psychological edge, and for that mistake is hounded and persecuted by sharks and people who basically make their living, being examples of toxic masculinity, and who really have like no place or authority, to criticize or even attempt to empathize, with the situation, because they're so remote from it. I'm referring to individuals like Joe Rogan, but not just Joe Rogan. All of the sharks that smell blood, and it's so interesting too, because it's all done in the name of support of the community, right? Like we condemn this person for doing this, even though like day after day, like we go on our show and commit acts of verbal violence and get everything wrong and fail to empathize with those individuals who are suffering and being oppressed, and present ourselves as these, powerful, like cruel, sadistic, and we talk about, fighting, and we talk about, bloodlust, and we talk about all of these macho things. But then when someone, loses it for 5 seconds, then he becomes a target for our wrath, and that may not seem like an apocalyptos, in the global sense, but it belongs to the same mindset, right, of authoritarianism and destructive sadism that the psychology of fascism belongs to, and as such, it belongs to the same psychology and mindset that informs the actions of someone like Vladimir Putin, and as such that it performs its actions and its performativities under the aegis, under the shield of the archetype of destruction that is the nuclear holocaust. And in that sense, it belongs, right, to the discussion of the survivor of such, domains of destruction, which, is represented by this figure of the phoenix. And, so I was thinking about, all of that, and then in the communication of this message, and still, the problematic relationship between these navigational stars and destiny, and something like foam, that's a phenomenon of physics, but that creates this substrate, or I'll have to look up the term and actually look at the details of the chemistry. But as I understand what foam is, it's either a liquid or a solid, to which gas is added. We generally think of it as liquid, but when foam hardens, it becomes it can become solids like pumice or certain kinds of volcanic rock, right? That when this molten lava escapes the earth, it's subject to these forces and of thermal temperatures that release gas and bubbles, and as we saw yesterday in the physical demonstration of the creation of foam, heat can foster this infusion of gas into these substances that are not strictly liquid, but infused with bits of solid matter as well, that produce this substance. Now, this substance seems to be far from something that you would use to navigate, and in that way, the introduction of constellations, as well as this idea of this mythical bird, who exists in the Stravinsky opera, right, or the Stravinsky ballet, rather, as as a dancer, right? This is archetype of a dancer, in the same way that in the rites of spring, the rite, right, the repetition, the celebration of spring is an excuse for this dance of joy, and the dances of spring are not, merely limited to the human realm, but in fact birds do dance for joy at the dawn, or fly for joy at the dawn, and other creatures wake and stretch their muscles in different kinds of dances, and this is, in a sense, right, the renewal of life. In the morning, we sleep, the symbolic death, and into the unconscious, and then we awake and we stretch our muscles and we dance the dance of life, as if being born once again at the dawn, and that is also figured into the symbolic motif of the phoenix, right, the dance of the dawn. And so thinking about that, and the foam together, and then thinking about the different ways that I've used the phoenix, raises all of these questions about meaning, and the complexity of meaning and communication, and particularly the complexity in systems like, and not just limited to, but like space-time travel communication coordinates, where meaning is always already open-ended, and always already a matter of interpretation, and always already a matter of finding constellations, right? Like these constellations of stars, where this one represents the phoenix, but constellations of meanings and maps in systems that are available to us, via contextualizations. So I was thinking about that because, I've utilized the figure of the phoenix in this configuration of stars, right? That can draw this map of various references that seem to be tied together by this figure of Anka, or the phoenix, Alankwa, the firebird constellation, and one of the figures through which the phoenix appears in a lot of my work is as duck rabbit. And so duck rabbit in and of itself, it is another referent, and not strictly synchronous with the idea of either destiny and destination by starlight, either symbolic or literal, or the idea of the creature who rises from the ashes, and so it's yet another figure. So we have this curious constellation, a very curious constellation of figures. One is of the figure of the constellation itself, a map, right? A drawing through which, or a string of imaginary lines that create a figure, but also, through which, in the way that these structures are drawn in the sky, that create a map by which we can navigate both our destinies and the journeys that we're on towards some fixed location, if we're attempting to get to a fixed location. I had talked about, so context is important in understanding messages and meanings and communication. I had talked about destination motivated designs and games and systems, as opposed to wandering for the sake of wandering. And so this idea of the constellation as a map seems to configure into that particular aspect of that discourse, right? And belongs to what we set up as in the figure of the crossword puzzle, that this is a destination-motivated game, right? And so are our journeys destination-motivated. Odysseus is destination-motivated in his return from Troy to Ithaca, right? He's returning home. More destination motivated than we might be as we set out upon a journey leaving home, right? So the portrait of the artist as a young man in James Joyce, you recall that lovely section in the boy's notebook where the artist writes that he lives he goes to school here and in this town and in this country and in this on this island, and then finally Earth, and then the universe. So he belongs to these concentric circles, right, of sets of terrain or geography or ontology. And then one of his classmates makes fun of him and writes this parody, and it rhymes. My name is, Stephen Dedalus. I can't remember it, but it's silly, and of course it disturbs him because his placing himself in the world in this very specific loci within these larger, or within this very specific locus within these larger concentric loci, is part of his way of understanding and organizing his world, that in some ways, substitutes for the way that his world is constructed by the priests and teachers, who teach him that if he doesn't conform to a certain set of ideological constraints, that he'll burn in hell, right? And he prefers, his way of organizing the world within these, somewhat scientific concentric circles, and there's a kind of there's an innocence and naivete to what's being done, but in a larger sense, if you look at the way that he's formatively developing his intellect in acts of drawing, right, his place in the world and his independence from external ideological systems like the narrow view that the Catholic Church has in his traditional Irish education at the time. It makes a more powerfully philosophical statement than it appears to at the time. And again, we see in the child bully, the way that microsystems of politics, very much like the Joe Rogan analogy regarding the sharks wanting to feast on the blood of poor Will Smith, that these micropolitics that Stephen Dedalus is experiencing, in fact, belong to different ways of drawing the world and accepting and or rejecting the values of a community that may or may not be hostile to one's individuality and multiple positionalities within a social construct. So all of that's going on in the Stephen Dedalus, and relates to that system of constructing stars and Stephen, in that in that moment, hasn't yet found his duck rabbit, and he may never find his duck rabbit. In fact, James Joyce may never have found his duck rabbit, and if he did find his duck rabbit that was able to represent, right, the survival of a kind of destructive massively destructive either symbolic or actual event. You know, it was probably in the act of writing itself, right? And the shelter, in a certain sense, that the writing of such works as, you know, Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses, and the journey that such writings took, that belonged to this what is both real and irreal, in a sense, right? Because literature, as performed by James Joyce, you know, was always, you know, representational, and in that sense, you know, we could set up a binary opposition between representation and reality, but his reality was in the writing, and the duck rabbit, you know, for Joyce must have belonged there, that the writing was both real and representational, represented some imaginary, you know, domain outside of whatever destruction was. All right. Well, the our technological recording device cut out on us because apparently we had reached our limit, our capacity, in storage space, and I had to delete everything else. So we've undergone, you know, right now, we're returning from the destruction, right? You know, the reason that the piece is abruptly edited in that point is because the technological device, you know, failed to process any more information, and then as a result of that, I've had to eliminate a lot of information from my cell phone. And let's, you know, consider that a kind of destruction, and then this discourse that's going on right now is the phoenix rising, you know, from those ashes, you know, to create more. So in terms of that, you know, constellation of ideas that belong to this message in this particular star, the Phoenix, let me lay them out again, and then we'll address some of them. So a discourse on foam, and foam being this interval between states of matter in a certain sense, or composite in a sense, but neither belonging to you know, these fixed realms of ontology, solid or gas or liquid, but rather being a phenomenon of processes, right? And in that sense, being you know, either betwixt and between, or at the margins of, or being some result. And in that way, foam is much more like the duck rabbit, it seems to me, or much more clearly, at least, related to the figure of the duck rabbit, which people associate with Wittgenstein, but in fact precedes Wittgenstein. And I'd like to look at that and explore the history of the ambiguous figure of the duck rabbit, and how it's been used, and how Wittgenstein saw it, and how it was used before Wittgenstein, and what it's become a symbol of, and how in certain ways it also, like some of the parts of our discussion have, you know, bears upon the idea of string theory and the sort of post-positivist physics that belongs to ideas involving threads of time and alternative threads of time, and simultaneous realities, right? Such as the figure of Schrodinger's cat, right, who both can be and not be at the same time. So the duck rabbit relates to our figure of the and/or, but also relates to you know, our discussions and theories of interpretation as belonging to the nature of phenomenon, you know, and I've tried to clarify that in certain ways in the work that I do here, but anyone who's been paying any attention at all to the way that space-time travel system coordinates work will realize that if one one alters the communication by looking at it. That is, the communications to me are largely made, via views, not entirely only through views, but my viewers and readers will realize that since I work with this experience, that to view my work is to communicate, right? To view my work is to communicate. If your view shows up, it will be taken as an act of communication, whether you intend it to be or not. And as such, it very explicitly underscores the fact that observation changes the object, right? Because I will change the object, depending on the number of views, right? And not only will I change it, but I've suggested that even if I don't change it, the act of communication remains behind, inscribed in the system. So the system, as we've organized it, as we've constructed it, underscores and emphasizes this particular aspect of a post-Einsteinian universe in which observation, is in fact, change, and observation is a process, like the process of making foam is a process. And these views will never stay fixed. They can never really become, either a navigatory star in that sense, but they can provide these temporary, like constellary configurations, and the constellary configurations will always be unstable because they belong to these sets, multiple sets of contexts in which things may, by analogy, make sense in quotation marks, but they can never make full sense. Like the relationship to duck rabbit always has to be inferred or always has to be interpreted, right, to an idea like foam. I've suggested, and even in the rising from, foam seems to rise from some element of the process. Now that element of the process could be heat, like it was yesterday, that allows the foam to rise from the ashes of whatever substance that it's rising from, if one likes to, carry that metaphor forward. But it could be some other process. For example, if I used to smoke, and I don't smoke anymore, I have all of these restrictions on what I'm allowed to do and what I'm not allowed to do, and one of those restrictions is that I'm not supposed to smoke. So we won't have to get into why there are these restrictions, but it should be enough to say that, it's not good for you, and there's a history of the growth and production of tobacco in the United States. For one thing, big tobacco money, goes into a lot of destructive stuff, not just causing cancer, but the history of tobacco farming and growth in the United States is very much, tied to the history of slavery, and that should be enough, for anyone, to give up smoking. And if it's not, then you really haven't either considered history or considered the relationship to it. And I know that tobacco in certain, Native American traditions is sacred, and I respect that. But just like the swastika was once sacred, there are things that can be done to physical objects and symbols that are irredeemable. And what the Nazis did and utilized the swastika for, in at least in my opinion, make that sign, irredeemable, and it can't be, recontextualized because of the destruction of human life, and it'll become difficult for me to talk any further at this point, but. But the offense is too great, and the offense to the sacredness of human life is too great to utilize even any form of the symbol in any context, however separate from its use under Nazism, one wants to imagine that it is, as a respect for, those individuals who were destroyed in the Holocaust of the early 20th century. New ways of imagining those ancient symbols, have to be found and deployed in place of what was lost. So anyway, back to this idea of rising from, and as I was saying, I used to smoke, and I don't smoke anymore. But when I did, one of the things that I like to do with large amounts of ash, just because it's fun to look at the processes of nature and physics, was if I had large amounts of ash collected, I would take a little bit of vinegar, and I would pour it into the ash, and I would watch the rising foam bubble. So in this instance, it wasn't heat that created the bubbling and the foam, but it was the chemical reaction between the basic form of the ash, right? Ash has a pH that is basic, right? And the acidic form of the vinegar, because the pH value in vinegar is that of an acid, and the chemical reaction would create this foam, and in the foametric series, that may be the next one. Since I don't smoke, I'll have to burn something and create some ash, but that may be one of the next productions of foam. And in this sense, the foam really literally does rise from the ashes, right, with the introduction of vinegar. So this is another way that the duck rabbit, right, that we've semiotically, or by analogy, in its ambiguous conceptualization, it's an ambiguous figure, is like foam. But in a way, the foam, at least through this narrative that I've just provided of this action of physics and vinegar, in a way, the foam clarifies the relationship between the ambiguous figure of duck rabbit and the figure of the phoenix, doesn't it? Because foam literally does rise from ashes, or can literally rise from ashes. So this gives us a way in to start thinking about the message, right? And if we want to take it further, what is the acid that has to be added to whatever these ashes represent, that will allow the foam, or duck rabbit as the foam, to rise from them? And that's an interesting question too. And whatever it is, that catalyst, there has to be a catalyst. What is the catalyst if we want this rejuvenation, this rejuvenating figure of ambiguity, or this rejuvenating figure of foam, this renewal, this but newness as well, and process, to rise. What is the catalyst that's required? Now, since in our constellation we have duck rabbit, we have phoenix, we have we have the semantic fields that are associated with duck rabbit and with phoenix, and we have constellation and star and navigation, and we have foam, and then because we have duck rabbit and phoenix, we have all of these places contextually where they occur. And in my work, here's one site in which they occur, and one space-time coordinate in which they occur, and I'll read briefly some of the other material that can get added to the mix. So these are figures of as, ways that the figure of duck rabbit rises from the ashes might be interpreted. So I'll just, read them quickly. Duck rabbit rising from the ashes as brother wolf reasserting his bonds within the community, and or sister moon completely ignoring the YouTube community guidelines, and or FT Marinetti threats against her life. That's a reference to Let's Murder the Moonlight by the Italian fascist poet Marinetti, and or New York, California art professor as Austrian British language and logic professor, and or self-portrait as narrative fable as self-portrait as environmental crisis, and or what you see and hear as what I failed to see and or hear, and or what I saw and or heard as what you still fail to see and or hear, and or genius in quotation marks as genius underlined, and or Ian Ashbury as St. Francis of Assisi, and or beggars as kings as beggars, as kings as beggars, as beggars as kings. And there's a lot there, but what I want to focus on, because of the importance of context and contextualization in interpreting any message, is this passage right here, or these two passages if you're taking the and/ors as marking stanza breaks, right? So these two stanzas, perhaps if you're taking the ands/ors as marking stanza breaks, as in the way that we utilized different kinds of editing forms and structures to represent different breaks in poetics in the foam piece, right? So like phrasal units were marked by fades of 2 seconds, and then more radical and more I don't know how to describe it, but a different editing form, marked the end of a line. So you can have phrasal units and an understanding of a line marked by these fades, and then a different edit. The edit was a movement of the entire slide, marked a line break, and then of course that was a single stanza. And so if you're organizing a more complicated set of poetics, then you have to have signifiers of more complicated and various types of domain markers to mark off sets, and understanding of the way that these sets are either embedded within one another and represent either hypotactical relations or paratactical relations, or the levels of hypotaxis that can be implied by embedded sets, or the multiplicities of paratactical figures that may exceed beyond mere ands, right? So that one paratactical set could lead to another paratactical set that invariably or non-invariably belongs to further paratactical sets. Anyway, those become like branching units of stars. So like you could say that like at the end point of every say that the hand represents this and the fingers are paratactical constructs belonging to the hand that extend from this radiating center. But then at every point of the ending, the terminus of the fingers would represent a new hand, at which point a new paratactical set could radiate, right? Anyway, that's the idea that I'm getting at in complex figures of parataxis. We don't really often talk about that, because the and is seen as like it's either like if there's no hypotaxis, there's no complexity, but in in radiating figures of parataxis, there can be a lot of complexity, and there can be end nodes and there can be extending nodes. But the physics of that really exceeds the boundaries of our discussion here. All right, so what I want to focus on, I'll call these 2 points stanzas, and I want to focus on these 2 stanzas that are related, right, as a kind of radiant parataxis by the content of what is said here. And or, right, okay, so there's the marker that says this off. And or what you see and or hear as what I failed to see and or hear, and or what I saw and or heard as what you still fail to see and or hear. All right, and this particular figure also belongs to the context of some utterance that I had just made, or some active communication that I had just made elsewhere. And I don't know if we can find it or not. It's in response to a reading of some works by Robert Creeley, by another poet. And I had responded, I don't know if I still have my response or not. All right, so here is the quote that I made reference to, I'll go ahead and read this, and this is a configuration of space-time coordinates that I'm utilizing as a means of making a remark and communication and opening a discourse, that I'm seeing in the figure of the phoenix as somehow being a response to and trying to come to terms to in this discourse on foam. So TPITB, which is a reference to this phrase, the plan is the body. The plan is the body. I am reminded of Eloise Corbaz's statement regarding her dance performance of musical chairs in the theater of the embodied universe. And then I create this. And of course, this quotation is entirely, constructed and mine, and doesn't in fact belong to Eloise, who is in fact, some kind of historic figure, and as is the theater of the universe, but not as entirely constructed here. I learned to move those chairs to the left of people I had been aware of communicating with, and to the right of those whom I had imagined might eventually become aware of communicating with me. And of course, this is a figure of space-time travel communication coordinate systems, acts of communication in which communication isn't always intentional or conscious, or one may not be aware that in an observation one is in fact communicating. And so I'm referring to that whole process, and I'm utilizing reference to John Cage and his pieces of moving chairs as an examples of sound. I've got to say bye to Lori, so I've got to cut this off now, and then I'll return and try to make sense of it. So she's leaving for work. Okay, right, so she's taken off for work, and let's see. I'm at the point where I'm referring to all the different references in this piece. Some of those references. So one of the references is John Cage in the piece of Moving Musical Chairs. There's a piece that we have, up, or parts of the piece that we have up, and parts of a playlist that hasn't been entirely communicated, hasn't been entirely completed yet, but the playlist is referred to as Ladybug explains the basic principles of thermodynamics to a sowbug. And Ladybug explaining the basic principles of thermodynamics to a sowbug itself could be a reference to the creation of foam and how foam is made, right? The physics and chemistry of making foam, because foam can be made by instigating processes of changes in temperature, and it can be made by introducing relationships to new configurations of chemistries as well, right? As I described with the ash and the figure of ash in the rising of the Firebird as foam from the ash, through the inception and introduction of the chemical of vinegar, or presumably any other chemical that has the right pH level. So the chairs also relate to a section within Ladybug explains the basic principles of thermodynamics to a Sowbug, and if I go to that playlist briefly, and then I'll return to this page. So that playlist. Oops, that's mine. So okay, so here, and there are a number of songs, and I believe it's the first one. No. All right. So this one here, Ladybug explains the basic principles of thermodynamics to a Sowbug, and the second song in this playlist. This is a work of mine. You could, if it were published as such, you could conceive of it as an album, right? But it's clearly conceptually motivated. This would be a concept album, right? So part 2 is isothermal compression as a game of musical chairs, right? And as such, when I made the communication here, the musical chairs is a reference to that particular musical piece, isothermal compression as a game of musical chairs, as well as to the John Cage, and then obviously the theater of the universe, and here embodied universe, right? Because I want to talk about how we're always bodies, because since the plan is the body, the plan could be a system of stars, right? A map, right? We think of plan and map, but it can also be a goal, right? The goal. So the plan could be to get to destination X, Y, or Z, which is a destination-motivated game, or destination-motivated process, right? And then belongs to that first set of games that we were talking about, like the SATs, like the fixed stars, or the brightest stars by which we navigate, like a crossword puzzle, right? Single solution set type of games, perhaps. But if the body is the plan, and we all have different bodies, that can't work. It can never work, because there will always be a Denny, right? Someone who's left to the side. There will always be someone who either cannot see in the same way that we see, or cannot hear in the same way that we can hear. And this leads, me to the next part of the embodied discourse. I learned to move those chairs to the left of people I had been aware of communicating with, and to the right of those whom I had imagined might eventually become aware of communicating with me. And people can become eventually aware of communicating with you in different ways. And this is derived from part of a discourse and narration by Michael Davidson, and I've transformed it in a certain way. But at a certain point in his life, Michael Davidson lost the ability to hear in his left ear, and there are a number of reasons for that, but they're not important. They changed his embodied relationship to the universe, and as such, they changed his relationship to issues of disability and the embodied nature of poetics, and how individuals with disability create poetries and poetics and shed some light on the ways that poetics is always already an embodied process of belonging to the universe, and hence the theater of the embodied universe. Now, what one of the things that's interesting to me about this process in the life of Michael Davidson is that Michael Davidson was one of my professors or teachers prior to losing his hearing. And as I remember him as a professor, before he lost his hearing, he was not at all interested in the poetics of disability. And in fact, and it's interesting, like Will Smith, like now it's this big deal. Like everyone wants to go back and look at all of the times that Will Smith said something impolite or offensive about individuals who either had lost their hair or whatever it was, right? So like we're finding examples of ways that Will Smith can be a hypocrite because we want not to like Will Smith. Well, I like Will Smith no matter what, just because he's got a good heart, and also because he the figure of Jay in Men in Black was a big part of our political actions and utilizing Jay as a representation of those struggling to save democracy from the evil forces of the universe, and the way that he respectfully played Muhammad Ali and has done a lot of work that I think is important. To be perfectly honest, I'm not saying that Will Smith can do no wrong, but I respect his growth, in the embodied universe, and those examples of early moments of failure and lack of compassion, certainly don't affect my appreciation and respect for the man that he has grown into, right? No matter how immature he may have been as an adolescent. And anyway, this bears upon this discussion of this line by Michael Davidson, because as I remember him as a professor in the early '80s, was someone who was basically a middle class privileged language poet who wasn't particularly interested in politics in anything other than a cursory way, and rather, like, if I can say so, insensitive to some of the embodied forms of being in the world that I experience. In other words, meaning like he really didn't get that he really didn't get that I had a language and writing disability that both informed the way that I looked at things and the way that I came at things. So I had done this paper on Robert Creeley, and it had a lot of errors because I was still learning, and coming to terms with how I could process information and writing and all of this stuff and get away with being a profoundly dysgraphic and profoundly different kind of embodied subject in the university, which didn't eventually work out, but I was navigating those things both within the rules of the system and outside of the rules of the system, right? Like finding ways like to not produce the required amount of writing, or finding ways of reading what I could get through reading, instead of the overwhelming demands of reading like 17 novels a week or whatever it was at UCSD at that time. And is there really like a negotiation with my embodied manner of being in the universe and that university as universe's demands on the embodied subject. And Michael Davidson was one of these individuals who really didn't get it. Anyway, so I had done this paper on Robert Creeley, and I had talked about his sight, like which I saw as an important embodied element of Robert Creeley's work, and I traced it through a lot of these poems, and I tried to make an argument that a lot of the abstraction that you see, and it's not just in like I Know a Man, where like if you read that poem, I Know a Man, and I think that's the name of the poem, and it's like they're in this car, and it's like just keep your eyes on the road, and it's not about just driving in the darkness, but the whole thing gives you the sense that he's not like pointing to these objects like Creeley, in some ways is an imagist, but he could never have written the Red Wheelbarrow poem, right? Because it's pointing to all of these objects in the world and seeing them clearly, and so much depends upon. But Creeley's poems are all about like it and this man and having this conversation, and you don't really see these people in the car. You can imagine being in the car, but it's like you're watching the darkness outside. You're not like, you don't know what color the guy's tie is, or this or that, or it's much more like these figures of the Creator in the Old Testament, where the Creator comes to you as a voice, right? And the Creator comes to you as a voice, not a visual sign. And when the Creator is embodied in a visual object, it's something that's like that duck rabbit, right? That's really ambiguous, like a fire, like a bush on fire. And we don't know what kind of bush it is. It may be an acacia bush. And then that would make a lot of sense. And maybe the fire is just merely symbolic. So maybe it's like this, just not even a burning bush. Maybe it's just this, the I am is just in this acacia, and it seems to be speaking. But it both is and isn't, visualized in a certain way. But the voice, the voice is something like the inner voice that we experience. And one has this experience of Creeley. And the plan is the body, but in this very curious way that it's almost in the body by abstraction. And that's what Creeley is all about. And I tried to argue in this paper, and it was like a mess because of my writing disabilities. But I tried to argue in this paper that in these little poems and abstractions of Creeley, is the seed is this embodied subjectivity that belongs, to some of his optical, degeneration and this difficulty in seeing, and now I would have to do the research and find out, whether that this was as significant an issue, in Creeley's life as I imagined it being. But I didn't argue that, in this either or way. It was just that I found like this trace of ways in which the abstracted forms of imagism in Creeley, as opposed to someone like any really of the other the earlier imagists. But I thought of Creeley as like coming out of imagism, more than Black Mountain, and maybe other people didn't think that, so maybe that take itself was something that I had gotten wrong or didn't belong to, like this particular history of this particular discourse. But it was a way of like coming up with the constellation of Creeley as seeing like this phenomenology of the embodied subject and positionality, right? So physical and phenomenologically historical, subjectivity, and then that's the way I've always read things. But honestly, and again, like this is what the Will Smith caveat. At the time, Michael Davidson didn't seem to get it, and I'm not, saying that, so that people, will say, oh, well, so whatever he says about disability poetics, it has no merit and no value. It's like, no, he needed to experience, his embodiment more fully before, he could get the point. But I think he eventually really could see in a different way. So, or hear in a different way. His perception of these ideas became much more clear to him, through the process of losing part of his ability, of the ability that he took for granted, which was to hear, from both ears. So I want to go back to the origin of this phrase and talk about the way that I turned it. So this is Michael Davidson, and this is a different context, a context that belongs to that other reference, the theater of the universe, and Eloise or Eloise, or however you pronounce her name. So this is the paragraph from which I derived that expression. I remember vividly the first time I realized the extent to which space is an acoustic phenomenon. Okay, I was in Paris for a summer after my first operation. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna say, actually, in a certain way, Michael Davidson is misrepresenting this, and I'll narrate again another experience with him that and why I know this. This, in fact, was not the first time he realized the extent to which space is an acoustic phenomenon. Because I remember probably must have been around 1980, there was a music concert at UCSD, and I don't remember the name of the composer, but I remember the form that it took. It was electronic music, and it was presented in a pool. And the electronic music was piped into the water, and you couldn't hear it if you were if you lifted, so in order to hear it, you have to get into a bathing suit and get into the pool and submerge your ears in water. And then you could hear it. And it was a whole different experience of hearing, because it felt like it was coming from inside of one's head as opposed to outside in the world. And the water would flow into your ears, and the music would flow into your capacity to perceive the music through the water, not through the air. And it created this entirely different sense of both space and the perception of sound and acoustic phenomenon. And so, and Michael was there. Michael Davidson was there, and I remember talking to him. I was probably still a teenager, but I remember talking to him in the shower afterward about the music and about the perception of music and how it changed. And he was in disagreement with me that about the nature of the structure of the music, but he wasn't in disagreement with me about the phenomenon itself and my take on the experience of the phenomenon of the contact, right? Receiving the message through that particular physical form, of the message. If you read the Jacobson on the elements of communication, it would be really informative to read the Jacobson's take on the elements of communication and messages in relationship to perceiving phenomenon in this manner. And anyway, that particular contact and the experience of that particular contact, we agreed, what gave a different sense of the internalization, externalization phenomenon of the perception of sound. So he's constructing this narrative here, but it's not entirely truthful, because I do remember him having this conversation with me. And we both, in that moment, in what would have been circa 1980, realized the extent to which space is an acoustic phenomenon, okay? So anyway, I'll begin again. With that caveat, I remember vividly the first time I realized the extent to which space is an acoustic phenomenon. I was in Paris for a summer after my first operation and had lost my hearing on the left side. My brain had not adjusted to the hearing loss, and I was very unstable on my feet, even when walking on solid sidewalks. I remember stepping off a curb, having looked to my right without seeing any cars coming, but was almost run over by a driver on the left, whose car I couldn't hear coming. from that time on, I had literally to look both ways. I used to have, okay, I'm gonna break out there. I used to have a t-shirt when I was a child, when I was in about second grade. It was either second or third grade, and it said, "Look both ways before crossing." But it was written in this way. I guess my mother bought it for me because it was kind of a joke. I don't know, but it was spelled wrong. I think it was spelled in. It had a spelling error. Look both ways before crossing did, and it had an owl on it. And gosh, it makes me emotional thinking about it. Anyway, it had an owl, and it said, look both ways before crossing. And I guess it was kind of like a joke, and referred, to that expression, look both ways before crossing when you're a kid. But I think it also, like, was those kind of metapoetics, right? And it was like, be careful before you make fun of this guy, because he's smarter than he may think, based on all these spelling errors and problems in the writing. And at least that's the way that I took it. And maybe she didn't think of it that way and didn't get it or whatever, or I may have chosen the t-shirt. I don't even really remember, but I remember, like, I loved that shirt because it was like one of the early examples of my performance as atioN, right? And anyway, so that's Michael doesn't have access to that narrative, and that has no relationship to what he's saying, but it just reminds me of that experience. From that time on, excuse me, I had literally to look both ways and not rely on audio location. Balance was also a problem. I found walking on curved or bumpy roads very difficult and tended to hug the walls of buildings, trailing my fingers along the wall to steady myself. This would really be a problem for me because a lot of what I do is outside, and a lot of what I do is in motion and in time. And if I had these problems, I couldn't be the kind of astronaut, that I am. And it would probably, I know that, Michael, used to surf and things like this, but I don't think that the surfing was as much for Michael Davidson an embodied aspect of his early poetics as walking is for me, or as other forms of space-time travel is for me. So this would really be a problem for me if I couldn't walk, if I couldn't go, if I couldn't travel, if I needed a wall to rely on. And I can appreciate what a difficulty this is. I learned to sit on the left of people I wanted to talk to and the right of those I didn't. And that's where the quote comes from, because I'm the wanting, the desire, right? I'm flipping it. In the way that I use it to describe the plan is the body, right? It's no longer a matter of mere desire. It's a matter of the possibility of communication to begin with, right? That the awareness, right? The embodied awareness of, do you realize that you're communicating with me? Or do you realize that I'm communicating with you in this way? So I'm adding a level of communication theory as well as phenomenology that I'm sure Michael would understand, but that isn't already in what he's saying. As I get older, I noticed that spatial positioning of the subject, of the hard of hearing person in social situations, is a common topic and subject of much senior movement. Levity, positioning, balance, judgment, walking. These are, I don't know how to say this word, again, and then if you want to, you can make fun of my inability to pronounce this word. You can overlook the fact that I'm talking about dysgraphia, and you can point to the fact that I can't pronounce this word as an example of my idiocy. Even though, like I've reminded my audience, on numerous occasions that I don't read words by sounding them out. I have to have the form of the word. That dysgraphia is significant enough that encountering a word that I haven't seen before gives rise to significant difficulty in interpretation. You can ignore all of that and just laugh, or you can position yourself to the left of me because what I have to say isn't worth listening to because I can't pronounce this word. So looking at it, and I really have to spend some time like trying to decipher it letter by letter. Proprioceptive, but I have to spend a lot of time proprioceptive. I have to spend a lot of time looking at it, more than someone would be able to just glance at if they didn't have the kind of cognitive disability that I do. Experiences that condition the body to the world, and to find them out of joint is to find oneself, to adapt Hamlet out of time. Now, a lot of you can read into Michael Davidson's descriptors a lot of the pain of loss, right? Because unlike those of us who have had disabilities from the inception of our lives, losing an ability to perceive or do things that you had the ability to do is experienced as a physical loss. And Michael is certainly aware of the social implications of disability studies and all of this. And he's really good at, not being Christopher Reeves, right? Like not being that version of Superman that wants to say that as long as we get the stem cells and go back to being normal, that's what we really need. Like, I'm not saying that Michael Davidson is Christopher Reeves, and Christopher Reeves lost his ability late too. But those who do experience this disability in a different way, and you can really read here the loss, right? I used to be able to do these things, now I can't. I had to relearn this. I had to do la. And there's a lot of melancholy and mourning, right, in this passage. And for those of us who've always had our disabilities, always already couldn't read, or always already were made fun of, there's a slightly different sense of it, right? And again, I'm not discounting that that Michael learned in the same way that Will Smith learned, but he didn't always have someone in his environment who was bald. He didn't grow up with an older sister with alopecia. He had to come to his compassion, and like Michael, had to come to his compassion and learn to look both ways. So there's already this seed. There's a little seed, right, of discompassion in this figure of there are people who deserve to be listened to and those who don't, and I get to choose, right? And for those of us who grew up, struggling to communicate from the very beginning and struggling to do those things that other people could do automatically from the very beginning, there was never I want to communicate with that one, but not that one, or whatever, it's struggling to communicate was always already on both sides, the left and the right, a matter of hard work and positioning. And hiding, because if you admitted that, you couldn't hear from your left ear, then you were excluded, right? So there was a lot of there was always already a lot of deception and hiding, and because if you admitted that you couldn't hear from your left ear, you were either like teased or insulted, or and if you defended yourself, you were beaten up, and people would, this is the way that it is, and and so some of us, never really experienced this kind of thing as loss in the same way, but as an always already, right? You're always already embodied, and you can come, to this understanding, but you'll come to it in a way that expresses surprise. I had literally to look both ways. It's like, yeah, duh. And I don't say that to be mean. I just say it, like, welcome to my world, right? And so all of that, is part of the configuration of now I can't seem to find it. Oh, I think I lost it. Okay, so all of that is part of the configuration that I'm trying to get at here, right? In returning to Robert Creeley, and returning to the plan is the body, and returning to notions of empathy and subjectivity, and that discussion, and why, in this discussion of foam, like I think that that's interesting, and returning to this line, what you see and hear as what I failed to see and hear, and or what I saw and heard as what you still fail to see and hear. And in that foam, as experiment and process of observation, and seeing the foam, and seeing the process turn into some kind of substance, even if that substance, is merely temporary, like foam. But in a sense, all things are temporary, right? Because all things exist in time and in process, and in failing to see and hear, like Michael Davidson became aware in his quotation of Emily Dickinson. I failed to see, or I failed to hear. In the failure of his left ear, he learned to symbolically, look both ways, maybe before crossing, and also to understand, in a way, what he was so incapable of understanding when he could hear from both his left and his right ear, and in that way, he's been granted a position at a certain kind of table, no matter who is sitting on his left or right, that he wouldn't have been granted had he not lost his hearing. Let's go back to alpha phonesis. I'm going to assume that it's alpha phonesis. It took me a long time to process the word, but it's from Phoenix, and I'm still not entirely sure how to pronounce it. But this is all about, navigation as seeing and as brightness, and how one navigates, in the dark. And it's also about, how one rises from destruction. And for those of us, with disabilities, whether they were, whether we always already had them, and the real destruction was primarily social, or whether they, were late onset or later onset as a result of injury or disease. and were experienced as loss of part of the sense of one's embodied identity as a physical subject, like they were with Michael. Whether the destruction is experienced in one way or more than another, the destruction is there, and the rising, as foam rises from the ashes, with the introduction of vinegar, is something that one either accomplishes, or if one fails, then one is simply destroyed. So it's an ongoing process of continual destruction and continual resurrection, as it is with all positions of marginalization, and in that way, this particular communication is however it was intended, is a powerful incitation of further discourse on the kinds of topics that we engage with and have been engaging with, as I said, at least since the late 70s in what we do, and will be the way that we engage our world until we're gone, because I guess we belong to this class of Phoenix that rises, and apparently, like, all you need is either heat or vinegar.